On December 19, 1852, lawyer Augustus Peton appeared before the Henriot County Court. He proceeded to publicly read a last will and testament that was destined to fracture one of Virginia's most respected families. This final declaration from Violet Harrington, who had passed away just 3 days prior at the age of 41, designated a man named Daniel Freeman as the sole heir to her entire estate. The vast estate included the Willowbrook Plantation, a property consisting of 3,200 acres of premium tobacco farmland, 117 enslaved individuals, the main residence with all its contents, investments valued at roughly $73,000, and various urban properties situated in Richmond. The total worth of the estate exceeded $200,000, positioning it among the largest holdings in Virginia. Peton maintained his composure while reciting these specific bequests. However, his voice wavered noticeably as he read the script's final passage. Daniel Freeman was neither a distant relative nor a business associate. He was, legally, Violet Harrington's property right up until the moment of her death. He was an enslaved man who had functioned as her house steward for the past 12 years. The courtroom immediately descended into chaos. Violet's brother, Nathaniel Harrington II, surged toward the lawyer, yelling that the will was fabricated. Violet's 2 adult children from her initial marriage insisted the document be immediately destroyed. 3 cousins, who were set to inherit nothing, began loudly questioning Violet's sanity and suggesting undue influence. Yet, Augustus Peton had prepared for this intense reaction. He calmly presented a second document, a marriage certificate dated September 7, 1851. This certificate bore the signatures of Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman, and was officially witnessed by a minister and 2 other individuals. Crucially, it had been recorded in a courthouse in Pennsylvania, where such marriages were legally valid. A sudden, tense silence fell over the courtroom. The uproar then resumed, louder and more intense than before. This was because if the marriage was considered valid, and if Virginia was compelled to recognize it under federal comity laws, which govern state recognition of other states' acts, then Daniel Freeman was not merely receiving an inheritance as a formerly enslaved person. He was receiving it as the lawful husband of Violet Harrington. The subsequent court case would consume 4 years, devastate 2 families, expose long-held secrets of powerful figures, and force Virginia's judiciary to face deeply uncomfortable questions they had hoped to avoid. But the true beginning of the saga occurred 16 months earlier in the library at Willowbrook Plantation, where a woman facing death and the man she loved elected to take a risk that would dramatically outlive them both. Blackheart, a community of mystery enthusiasts. Before we delve deeper into the extraordinary story of Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman and the inheritance that sent shockwaves through Virginia society, if you find this narrative compelling, please ensure you subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our detailed explorations of America's most obscure historical mysteries. Also, we'd love for you to tell us in the comments which state or city you're tuning in from. We always enjoy hearing from our global community of history and mystery aficionados. Mantelpiece Clock, Virginia on the precipice. In 1851, Virginia was hovering on the brink of disaster, although the majority of its white inhabitants chose to ignore this reality. The state's economy was completely dependent on enslaved labor. Its societal structure was constructed upon a rigid racial hierarchy, and its political leverage was derived from the 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved people as partial persons for congressional seats while simultaneously affording them no actual rights. Wealthy plantation owners held control over the state government, federal congressional representation, and most local political offices. They resided in grand manors, educated their children at elite universities, and had convinced themselves that the very system that enriched them was somehow natural, inevitable, and even compassionate. However, cracks were undeniably appearing. The abolitionist movement was gathering momentum in the northern states. The number of enslaved people escaping via the Underground Railroad was steadily increasing. Free black communities were expanding, proving that former slaves could succeed when given opportunities. Some Virginians, particularly those in the western mountain counties, were beginning to question whether the institution of slavery was worth the accompanying moral and economic cost. And critically, beneath the surface, in the kitchens, slave quarters, and hushed conversations, enslaved people were strategically planning, organizing, and awaiting the moment when the entire system would finally collapse. House with Garden. Willowbrook and the Harrington Legacy. Willowbrook Plantation was situated in Henrico County, just outside of Richmond. The property had been held by the Harrington family since 1768, passed down through 4 generations. The main dwelling was a Georgian colonial style, constructed of brick with white columns in 1792. Behind this structure stretched the tobacco fields, the cash crop that had established the Harrington fortune. Further back were the quarters that housed the 117 enslaved people who worked, lived, and struggled to maintain their humanity within a system designed for their destruction. Violet Harrington was born Violet Ashmore in 1811. Her father owned a shipping enterprise in Richmond, and her mother originated from a tobacco plantation family in Louisa County. Violet received the customary education for a young woman of Virginia's elite: music, French, literature, dance, and the social etiquette necessary to secure a favorable marriage. She was considered exceptionally intelligent, a quality her tutors viewed as a liability to be contained rather than a gift to be nurtured. They believed smart women made poor wives, they asked too many probing questions, held opinions on matters best left to men, and made their husbands uneasy. At the age of 19, Violet married Preston Harrington, the heir to Willowbrook Plantation. Preston was 28, conventionally attractive, educated at the College of William and Mary, and utterly unremarkable apart from his family's considerable wealth. The marriage was orchestrated by their parents as a strategic merger between shipping capital and plantation land. Violet and Preston had barely known each other before the wedding and learned only to tolerate one another afterward. The union produced 2 children, Randolph, born in 1831, and Lydia, born in 1833. Preston treated fatherhood as a completed chore. He provided for his children materially but showed minimal personal interest in them. He spent the bulk of his time supervising the plantation business, socializing and drinking with fellow planters, and frequenting Richmond, where he maintained a mistress, an open secret everyone knew about but officially ignored. Violet dedicated herself to managing the household and, increasingly, to reading. The Willowbrook Library housed over 3,000 volumes, collected by generations of Harringtons. Violet read insatiably: history, philosophy, political economy, and natural science. She educated herself far beyond the scope of her tutor's curriculum, developing strong opinions and perspectives that she soon learned to keep concealed from her husband and his peers. In 1843, Preston died unexpectedly at the age of 41. Officially, it was a riding accident. His horse threw him during a hunt, causing a broken neck. Rumors circulated that Preston had been inebriated, that the accident was actually suicide, or that gambling debts or other crises had driven him to it. Regardless, the official report deemed it a tragic accident, leaving Violet a widow at 32 with 2 children and a massive plantation to oversee. Under Virginia law, Violet was not the automatic inheritor of Preston's estate. The property should have passed to Randolph, the eldest son, with Violet receiving a widow's allotted portion and serving as his guardian until he reached adulthood. However, Preston's will, drafted just months before his death for reasons he never disclosed, left everything to Violet with complete control. Randolph and Lydia were slated to inherit only upon Violet's passing. Until then, she had full authority over Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. The male family members were incensed. Preston's brother, Nathaniel, was particularly resentful of a woman controlling such wealth. He immediately contested the will, arguing that Preston had been mentally unsound when he signed it. The ensuing legal battle consumed 2 years and thousands in legal fees. Violet ultimately prevailed, but the victory created enemies within her own family. From 1845 to 1851, Violet managed Willowbrook with surprising efficacy and skill. She employed competent overseers, executed shrewd business decisions, and conclusively demonstrated that a woman could manage a large plantation as effectively as any man. She also developed a reputation for being less cruel than most other planters. She prohibited the use of whipping posts, forbade the separation of enslaved families, and generally treated the people she owned with slightly more humanity than was the norm. This does not make her a saint. She was still an owner of human beings and still benefited from their forced labor. But on the spectrum of Virginia planters, she occupied the less monstrous end. Man office worker, the house steward. Daniel came to Willowbrook in 1839 as part of an estate settlement. He was 17 years old, born into slavery on a plantation in Caroline County. His mother, a house servant, had secretly taught him to read and write, a crime under Virginia law, but one she committed so her son would possess knowledge that might one day lead him to freedom. His father was unknown, possibly the previous owner, or perhaps another enslaved man. Daniel never learned the truth. Upon his arrival at Willowbrook, Daniel was assigned to work in the tobacco fields. He was physically strong, intelligent, and meticulously careful not to attract attention. He survived by being competent enough to escape punishment, yet not so exceptional that he became valuable as specialized labor, which could result in being sold away from the only community he knew. In 1846, the Harrington house steward, an elderly man named Moses who had served the family for half a century, died following a stroke. Violet required someone to manage the household staff, coordinate daily operations, and act as the representative of the enslaved labor to the white family and their guests. The role demanded intelligence, discretion, and the skill to navigate the divide between two worlds, the quarters where the enslaved people lived and the main house where the white family conducted their lives. The overseer recommended Daniel. He had observed Daniel's literacy, his meticulous mind, and his diplomatic nature. Violet interviewed Daniel herself, an uncommon act that drew comment from the household staff. She questioned him about his abilities, his background, and his suggestions for managing the household more efficiently. Daniel responded carefully, demonstrating competence without seeming threatening, and displaying intelligence without appearing presumptuous. Violet hired him as the house steward, effective immediately. The position provided him with marginally better living quarters, improved food, exemption from field labor, and authority over the 23 enslaved people who worked in and immediately around the main house. It also placed him in constant, close proximity to Violet herself, to her children, and to the daily intimacy of her life. For the first 3 years, the relationship remained strictly professional. Daniel managed the household with quiet efficiency. Violet interacted with him as she would any capable employee, issuing instructions and receiving reports, rarely engaging beyond what was strictly necessary. But they occupied the same spaces for hours every day, the library where Violet spent her afternoons reading, the dining room where Daniel oversaw the serving, and the front parlor where Violet hosted guests and Daniel managed refreshments. Books, proximity and passion. Proximity led to familiarity. Familiarity led to conversation. And conversation sparked something neither of them had intended. It began with books. Violet noticed Daniel glancing at titles on the library shelves when he believed he was unobserved. One day, she mentioned that if he wanted to read something, he was welcome to borrow any book he liked. Daniel looked at her with a mix of surprise and suspicion, wondering if this was a test, a deliberate trap to catch him violating the laws against enslaved literacy. "I am aware that you can read," Violet stated quietly. "Moses informed me before he passed. He said you were the most intelligent person on this plantation, and that intelligence is dangerous only when it remains unused. I would prefer that you use it." Daniel borrowed a book on Roman history, returned it 3 days later having clearly absorbed its contents, then borrowed a volume on natural philosophy, and finally, political economy. Violet began intentionally leaving out specific books, intrigued by what he would make of them. They started having short discussions about his reading material. Daniel was cautious initially, offering only safe, non-controversial observations, steering clear of anything that might sound like a critique of slavery or Virginia society. But Violet challenged him. What were his thoughts on Montesquieu's theories concerning climate and culture? How did he interpret Adam Smith's ideas about labor and capital? Did he agree with Jefferson's writings on natural rights, and if so, how did he reconcile them with Jefferson's status as a slave owner? These were perilous conversations. Every single word could be used against Daniel if Violet chose to do so. Yet, she seemed genuinely interested in his intellect, treating him more as an intellectual peer than as property. Daniel began to take risks, offering his genuine opinions and engaging in actual debate. By 1849, they were spending an hour or more conversing daily. Ostensibly, these were meetings to discuss household management, but they had evolved into something else entirely. They discussed literature, politics, philosophy, and the future of Virginia and the entire nation. They debated whether slavery could be reformed or if it must be completely abolished. They analyzed the moral contradictions of owning human beings while professing to be Christians. They talked about everything except the fundamental impossibility of their situation. Violet's children observed the unusual closeness. Randolph, 18 years old in 1849 and preparing to matriculate at the College of William and Mary, found it inappropriate. To him, his mother's reliance on the opinion of an enslaved man was a sign of weakness, an unacceptable blurring of boundaries that should be absolute. Lydia, 16 and more perceptive than her brother, noticed something else. She saw her mother animated in a way she never was with her father. She watched Daniel's careful mask occasionally fall away to reveal authentic emotion. She understood that a relationship was developing that society would never, under any circumstances, tolerate. Broken-hearted gambit against death. In September of 1849, Violet fell ill. What began as a persistent cough quickly worsened into something much more serious. Dr. Leonard Ashby, the family doctor, diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis. At that time, it was effectively a death sentence. Some patients lingered for years, others declined rapidly. There was no cure, only symptom management and a faint hope of spontaneous remission. Violet received the diagnosis with characteristic composure. She inquired about the prognosis. Dr. Ashby estimated 2 to 4 years, perhaps longer, with meticulous care. She asked about treatment, rest, fresh air, nutritious food, and avoiding stress. She simply nodded and thanked him for his candor. That evening, alone in the library with Daniel during what had become their nightly conversation, Violet revealed her diagnosis for the first time. Dr. Ashby suggests I may have 3 years, possibly less. Daniel, who had been organizing books on a shelf, froze. He stood motionless for several seconds before turning to face her. I am sorry, Mississippi. Are you? I would assume my death would bring relief. One fewer owner in the world. It is not that simple. No, Violet agreed. Nothing is simple. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Violet spoke again. I have been considering what will happen after I die. The plantation will go to Randolph. He is not inherently cruel, but he is conventional. He completely believes in slavery, never questioning it. I worry about what will become of the people here under his authority. We will survive, Mississippi. We always do. Survival is not enough. You deserve more than survival. Daniel looked her directly in the eye for the first time in the conversation. What I deserve is irrelevant to what I will receive, Mississippi. What if it could be? What if I could arrange something before I die that would grant you true freedom, real opportunity? How? You cannot legally free me. Virginia law mandates that freed slaves must depart the state within 12 months. And even if you did free me, what would that accomplish? I would have to abandon everyone I know, move somewhere foreign, and start from nothing. What if there was an alternative? Over the following weeks, Violet elaborated a plan that was audacious, likely illegal, and guaranteed to be scandalous. She would travel to Pennsylvania, where interracial marriage was legal. Daniel would travel separately to avoid suspicion. They would marry there legally. Violet would then write a will bequeathing her entire estate to her husband, Daniel Freeman, the surname she would help him choose. Upon her death, if both the marriage and the will were found to be legally valid, Daniel would inherit the entirety of the Willowbrook estate. Daniel's initial reaction was to suspect Violet had lost her mind. The plan was fraught with potential failures. Virginia could refuse to acknowledge a Pennsylvania marriage, especially a biracial one. Her family would certainly contest the will. The courts might invalidate the marriage on the grounds that his enslaved status made genuine consent impossible. Even if every legal hurdle was overcome, Daniel would inherit a plantation full of enslaved people, making him a slaveholder, the very thing he despised. But Violet had anticipated these objections. The marriage would be legally valid in Pennsylvania. Federal comity laws required states to acknowledge marriages legally performed in other states, even if those marriages could not have been performed locally. Virginia courts would therefore be compelled to recognize the marriage. Her family could challenge the will, but if the marriage was valid, Daniel's inheritance rights as a legal husband superseded other claims. As for the moral dilemma of inheriting enslaved people, Violet proposed that Daniel would immediately begin the process of manumitting everyone, a process that would require time but was achievable. He could sell the plantation to finance the relocation of freed people who wished to move north. Or, he could continue operating it as a paid labor farm, a concept practically unheard of in Virginia but theoretically possible. Why? Daniel finally asked. Why would you do this? Violet gazed at him for a long moment before responding. Because I have spent 40 years in this society and participated in its evil. I owned you. I own over 100 other people. I have profited from their forced labor. I cannot undo my past actions. But I can perhaps use my death to create a small measure of justice. And because, she paused, then continued quietly, because I have developed feelings for you in ways that I should not have, but cannot prevent. Not as property, not as an employee, but as a person whose mind I admire, whose company I value, and whose freedom I desire to see more than I want my family's approval. You are speaking of feelings that are impossible. Yes. Illegal, and certainly immoral by the standards of everyone we know, but true nonetheless. Daniel sat in silence, absorbing this confession. Finally, he replied, I would be dishonest if I said I didn't feel similarly. But feelings do not alter reality. You are my owner. Any relationship between us is by definition exploitative because you hold all the power. Which is precisely why we would marry in Pennsylvania, where I would have no power over you, where you would be legally free to decline, where whatever choice we make would be our choice, not one dictated by bondage. Ring the decision and the journey. They debated the controversial plan for weeks. Daniel saw every possible failure and all the dangers it posed. Yet, he also recognized the immense opportunity it presented, not just for himself, but for everyone at Willowbrook. If he inherited and subsequently freed them all, over 100 individuals would gain their liberty. That potential was worth any tremendous risk. In July of 1850, they made their decision: they would attempt it. The logistics were intricate. Violet could not simply disappear from Virginia without offering an explanation. She announced to her family and friends that her health required a trip to the mineral springs in Pennsylvania, a common treatment for consumption. She would be gone for several weeks, accompanied by her lady's maid, Clara, and 2 other servants to maintain appearances. Daniel needed to be away from Willowbrook at the same time without raising suspicion. Violet arranged for him to travel to Richmond on an extended errand to purchase household supplies, a task that could plausibly take a week. She supplied him with travel documents identifying him as a trusted servant conducting plantation business. In late August 1850, they both departed Virginia separately. Violet traveled north with her small entourage, stopping at various locations to uphold the facade of a health journey. Daniel traveled to Richmond, then vanished onto a northbound train using the travel papers Violet had given him. They rendezvoused in Philadelphia on September 2, 1850. Violet had rented rooms in a boarding house using an assumed name. Daniel arrived separately, posing as a free black man traveling on business. For 3 days, they finalized their plan, consulted with a lawyer Violet had hired to ensure the marriage would be legally unimpeachable, and prepared for the momentous step they were about to take. On September 7, 1850, at a small church in Philadelphia, Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman were married. The minister was a Quaker with abolitionist sympathies who asked no probing questions about their pasts. The witnesses were 2 members of the local free black community whom Daniel had met through Underground Railroad contacts. The ceremony was brief, simple, and legally binding. They spent one night together as husband and wife in a Philadelphia hotel. It was the only night of their entire relationship where they stood on equal legal footing, where neither owned the other, and where their connection was purely voluntary. They talked through the night about their hopes, the dangers ahead, and the deep meaning of their marriage. The next morning, they reverted to their respective roles. Violet resumed her identity as a wealthy Virginia widow. Daniel became her enslaved servant once more. They journeyed back to Virginia separately, maintaining the elaborate lie that they had been in different places for different purposes. Writing hand the final document. When Violet returned to Willowbrook in late September 1850, she resumed her life as the plantation mistress. Daniel returned to his position as house steward. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but everything was fundamentally different. Violet immediately contacted attorney Augustus Petton in Richmond. Petton was known for his discretion and willingness to take on unusual cases. Violet explained her requirement, a will that would transfer her entire estate to Daniel Freeman. Not to my servant Daniel, but to my husband, Daniel Freeman, she specified, presenting the marriage certificate as supporting evidence. Petton was stunned but maintained his professionalism. He advised Violet that such a will was guaranteed to be challenged, that Virginia courts would likely seek every means to nullify it, and that her family would never accept the outcome. Violet acknowledged all of this and instructed him to draft the will exactly as planned. The will was completed and signed on November 12, 1850. Violet entrusted it to Pétain for safekeeping, along with a sealed envelope containing the marriage certificate and a letter explaining her intentions. Pétain was explicitly instructed to open the envelope only upon Violet's death and to execute the will precisely as written, irrespective of family opposition. For the subsequent year, Violet and Daniel lived in an impossible reality. They were legally married but forbidden from acknowledging it. They cared for each other but could not show it publicly. They planned for a future they would never share, knowing that Violet's death would be the pivotal moment when Daniel finally gained the freedom and resources necessary to help others. Candle the farewell. Violet's health deteriorated slowly throughout 1850 and into 1851. The consumption gradually worsened. Some days she felt well enough to manage plantation affairs. Other days she was confined to bed, coughing blood and struggling severely to breathe. Dr. Ashby visited regularly, providing laudanum for the pain and sympathy for a suffering he could not cure. Daniel attended to Violet throughout her illness with a devotion that the household staff noticed and found deeply moving, though they misunderstood its origin. They believed he was simply a loyal servant tending to his dying mistress. They did not know he was a husband caring for his wife. In October of 1851, Violet summoned her children to her bedside. Randolph was 20 years old and in his final year of college. Lydia was 18, being courted by several eligible young men. Violet informed them about the will she had written. She did not reveal Daniel as the beneficiary, instead stating vaguely that she had made provisions she believed were right and that they should trust her judgment. Randolph was instantly suspicious. What provisions? Who is inheriting? Father intended, you will learn when I die. Until then, my affairs are mine to manage as I see fit. Your father left everything to me. I will dispose of it as I choose. The conversation ended disastrously, with Randolph storming out and Lydia looking deeply concerned. After they left, Daniel helped Violet back into bed. She was exhausted by the confrontation, struggling for breath. They are going to despise you when they learn the truth, Violet whispered. They already despise me. I am property to them. This will simply provide them with different reasons for the same hatred. I wish we had more time. We have the time we have. It is more than most enslaved people ever get with the people they love. It was the first time either of them had used the word love directly. Violet took Daniel's hand, gripping it weakly. I do love you. I need you to understand that this is not just about justice or wealth redistribution or striking a blow against slavery. Those things are true, but they are not the whole truth. I love you, and I wish we lived in a world where that was possible without all this deception. I love you too, Daniel said quietly. And when you are gone, I will execute every detail we planned. I will free everyone here. I will use what you have given me to fight this system in every possible way. Your death will translate to freedom for over 100 people. That is what our love created. Violet died on December 16, 1852, at 9 in the morning. Daniel was by her side, holding her hand, whispering that she had accomplished something good, that she would be remembered not for the evil she had participated in, but for the right she had tried to bring about at the end. She passed away peacefully, a small mercy. The household entered formal mourning. Messages were dispatched to family members. Funeral arrangements were made, and attorney Augustus Pétain was notified to initiate the execution of the will. Pétain arrived at Willowbrook on December 18 with the sealed documents. He met with Randolph, Lydia, and other family members in the library. He opened the envelope Violet had entrusted to him and publicly read the letter explaining her intentions. The letter was unreserved, Violet acknowledged that her actions would seem incomprehensible to her family. She clarified that she had legally wed Daniel Freeman in Pennsylvania in 1851, that the marriage was entirely valid under the law, and that she had exercised her legal right to designate her husband as the sole inheritor of all her possessions. Violet asked her children to accept that her motivation was not to cause them pain, but to attempt to achieve some measure of justice using the wealth their family had accrued through the institution of slavery. She expressed her hope that they would refrain from challenging the will, though she admitted she expected they would. Following the letter, Peton read the terms of the will. He then presented the marriage certificate, which was properly registered in Pennsylvania, bearing both Violet's and Daniel's signatures, and officially recorded and witnessed. The room exploded into the predicted chaos. Randolph shrieked that the document was impossible, a fraudulent, illegal act. Lydia sat motionless, visibly struggling to comprehend the astonishing revelation. Nathaniel Harrington, Violet's brother-in-law, screamed threats to murder Daniel immediately. Other relatives vociferously demanded that the documents be instantly destroyed. Peton remained composed. As a lawyer, he was accustomed to intense conflict. He calmly explained that the marriage was legally sound under Pennsylvania law and that Virginia was obligated to recognize it based on federal comity principles. He detailed that as Violet's legitimate husband, Daniel possessed superior inheritance rights to any other potential claimant. He further clarified that challenging the will would require them to prove either that the marriage was invalid or that Violet was mentally unsound, neither of which he suggested they could successfully demonstrate. He was her property. Nathaniel yelled. She owned him. A marriage can't be valid when one person owns the other. Peton countered, the marriage ceremony took place in Pennsylvania, where Mr. Freeman became legally free the moment he entered the state. Mrs. Harrington held no legal power over him there. The marriage was conducted between two free individuals, both fully capable of consent. She was insane, another cousin cried. Consumption warps the mind. She was not competent to make these decisions. Dr. Ashby examined her consistently until her death, Peton replied. His records show absolutely no evidence of mental incapacity. She was physically sick, but her mind remained sharp. The arguments persisted for several hours, but Peton was meticulously prepared. He had a counter-argument for every legal challenge and an answer for every objection. The will, he insisted, would stand unless a court officially overturned it. Daniel stood silently throughout the confrontation, observing the wealthy white people fiercely debating his right to inherit from his wife. On multiple occasions, family members hurled insults or threats directly at him. He never responded, maintaining the quiet dignity that had allowed him to survive years of bondage. Finally, Peton announced that, in his capacity as the executor of the estate, he was legally required to transfer all property to Daniel Freeman, effective immediately. The family had the right to file legal challenges, but until a court ruled otherwise, Daniel was the lawful owner of Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. Including the slaves? Randolph asked with corrosive sarcasm. Is he their master now? Under current law, yes, Peton confirmed. All enslaved people at Willowbrook are now the property of Mr. Freeman. The sheer implication was horrific, yet almost darkly comical. Daniel, who had been enslaved property just 3 days prior, was now the legal owner of over 100 human beings. In 72 hours, he had vaulted from the bottom rung of Virginia's racial hierarchy to a position of significant property ownership. Raised fist the new master's promise. The reality, however, was far more nuanced than a simple transfer of property. The enslaved community at Willowbrook were aware that something extraordinary had taken place. News had circulated through the quarters concerning Mrs. Violet's will and Daniel's seemingly impossible inheritance. They didn't yet know the full details, but they understood that their world had been fundamentally altered in ways that were both hopeful and terrifying. On December 19, Daniel called a gathering of every enslaved person at Willowbrook. They assembled in the largest barn on that cold winter evening, apprehensive about what demands this new master might make. Daniel stood before them and disclosed the entire truth. He recounted his marriage to Violet, their radical plan to use her death as a mechanism for freedom, and his firm intention to begin manumitting every person as quickly as Virginia law would permit. He detailed his plan to sell the plantation to abolitionist investors and utilize the proceeds to help the newly freed people relocate to the North or to establish themselves as free citizens within Virginia if they chose to remain. The reaction was initially stunned silence, followed by a torrent of questions, and then cautious hope. Clara, Violet's maid who had accompanied her to Pennsylvania, corroborated the entire narrative. She confirmed she had witnessed the marriage and had kept the secret for over a year. Several older enslaved individuals, who had known Daniel since his arrival at Willowbrook, spoke out to vouch for his character, assuring the others that they believed he would honor his commitment. But fear was also palpable. The Harrington family would relentlessly fight this. Virginia's courts might still void the will. Even if Daniel won legally, powerful white people might simply kill him and falsely claim an accident. The offered freedom was immense, but it risked being violently withdrawn before anyone could claim it. Daniel acknowledged these anxieties. He stated that he could promise nothing except that he would use every resource he possessed to fulfill Violet's final wishes. He warned them that the ensuing months, and possibly years, would be filled with uncertainty, and that they would need to place their trust in him and collaborate to resist the forces determined to reinstate the old system. The meeting concluded with a tentative sense of solidarity. Daniel was not yet fully trusted, but he was no longer viewed as just another owner. He was something unprecedented, a bridge between bondage and liberty, using the master's own legal tools to dismantle the system itself. Classical building. The legal battle begins. The legal conflict officially commenced on December 23, 1852, when Nathaniel Harrington filed a challenge to Violet's will in the Henrico County Court. His petition advanced three primary claims. Invalid marriage, that the marriage was void because it violated Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws, regardless of where the ceremony was performed. Mental incompetence, that Violet had been mentally unsound due to her illness. Undue influence, that Daniel had unduly coerced Violet to fraudulently obtain the marriage and the inheritance. Augustus Peton filed swift replies, refuting all three claims. The marriage was valid under Pennsylvania law and therefore must be recognized by Virginia. Violet's mental competence was confirmed by Dr. Ashby's medical records and numerous witnesses. Proving undue influence was nearly impossible and required evidence of coercion that simply did not exist. The case instantly became a major sensation. Newspapers across Virginia provided extensive coverage. Some outlets sensationalized it as the tragic deception of a dying woman by a cunning slave. Others framed it as proof that slavery was inherently corrupting the white moral character. A few abolitionist publications lauded it as a brilliant internal strike against the slave system. The trial began on February 14, 1853, in Richmond. Judge Thomas Crawford presided, a conservative jurist known for his strict adherence to legal precedent. The courtroom was jammed with spectators, journalists, and members of Virginia's planter elite who viewed the case as a fundamental threat to their entire way of life. Nathaniel's attorney, Benjamin Wickham, one of Virginia's most respected lawyers, centered his strategy on proving that Violet had been manipulated by Daniel over years of inappropriate intimacy, that her illness had compromised her mental capacity, and that the marriage was a fraudulent scheme designed to seize the Harrington estate. Wickham presented several witnesses. Family members testified about Violet's increasingly erratic behavior in her final years. Neighbors claimed to have seen Daniel and Violet alone together in the library for hours, suggesting an inappropriate familiarity. Dr. Ashby was pressed to speculate on whether consumption could affect mental function, though he cautiously stated that Violet had exhibited no signs of cognitive impairment. The most dramatic testimony came from Randolph Harrington. He described his mother's declining health, her withdrawal from social obligations, and her increasing reliance on Daniel. He portrayed a vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by a calculating slave who recognized an opportunity for wealth and freedom. She was dying, Randolph stated, his voice thick with emotion. She was frail, in agony, desperate for comfort. He took advantage of that vulnerability. He made her emotionally dependent on him and then convinced her to marry him and give him everything. It is the absolute worst kind of exploitation. Balance scale cross-examination and verdict. Under cross-examination, Peton effectively dismantled Randolph's testimony. He established that Randolph had been away at college for most of the period he was testifying about, that his contact with his mother in her final years was minimal, and that his description of her mental state directly contradicted Dr. Ashby's medical records. He highlighted that Randolph's primary motivation appeared to be his lost inheritance, rather than his mother's actual well-being. Peton then introduced his own witnesses. Clara testified about accompanying Violet to Pennsylvania and witnessing the marriage. She described Violet as being completely in control of her faculties, making clear, conscious decisions, and fully understanding the implications of her actions. Mrs. Violet was the strongest woman I ever met, Clara declared. Even dying, she was stronger than most healthy people. She knew what she wanted and she made it happen. Nobody was manipulating her. She manipulated all of us. The minister who had performed the ceremony traveled from Philadelphia to testify. He described his extensive conversation with Violet before the ceremony, her clear articulation of her intentions, and her understanding of the legal and social ramifications. He asserted unequivocally that she was a willing participant acting with full mental capacity. But the most compelling testimony came from Daniel himself. Peton called him to the stand on February 23, 1853. It was an extraordinary moment for an enslaved person to testify in a Virginia court, even one who was technically free under the contested will. A silence fell over the courtroom as Daniel took the oath. Peton led Daniel through his life history, his birth, his arrival at Willowbrook, and his 12-year relationship with Violet. Daniel spoke with extreme caution, aware that every word could be used to nullify the will. He described how Violet had encouraged his reading, engaged him in intellectual discussions, and treated him with a respect unusual for an enslaved person. He acknowledged that their relationship had deepened over the years and that feelings had developed that neither had initially sought. He explained that the marriage had been Violet's sole idea, that she had planned it, and that he had initially resisted because he saw all the ways it could fail. "Why did you finally agree?" Peton inquired. "Because she offered me the chance of freedom, not just for myself, but for every person at Willowbrook. Because she was dying and wanted to use her death to create some good out of the evil she had participated in, and because I loved her." The courtroom erupted loudly at this confession. Judge Crawford called for order. When silence returned, Peton pressed on, "Did you manipulate her? Did you take advantage of her illness?" "No, sir. Mrs. Violet was the most forceful person I ever knew. She made every decision. I simply followed her lead. If anyone was manipulated, it was me. Manipulated into hoping that freedom was truly possible, that this system could be fought from the inside. Wickham's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Daniel's character, his intelligence, and his audacity in believing he could marry a white woman. He insinuated that Daniel had deliberately seduced Violet, engineered her emotional dependence, and exploited her physical weakness. Daniel countered each assault with quiet dignity. Yes, he had encouraged Violet's dependence on his company, but she had reciprocated his dependence equally. Yes, he had participated in the marriage planning, but only after Violet had insisted repeatedly. Yes, he stood to gain tremendously from her death, but so did her legitimate heirs, and no one questioned their affection for her. The trial consumed 3 weeks. Both sides presented exhaustive evidence and arguments. The legal questions were genuinely complex. Did federal comity mandate Virginia to recognize a legally performed interracial marriage from Pennsylvania? Could such a marriage be valid if one party had previously owned the other? Did Violet possess the legal right to leave her estate to anyone she chose, even if that choice defied social norms? Judge Crawford took 2 weeks to deliberate before rendering his decision. On March 21, 1853, he read his ruling to a packed courtroom. He concluded that the marriage was legally valid under Pennsylvania law, that Virginia was required to recognize it under federal comity principles, that Violet had been mentally competent when she wrote her will and married Daniel, and that there was insufficient evidence of undue influence or fraud. Therefore, the will would stand. Daniel Freeman was declared the legal owner of Willowbrook Plantation and all its assets. The Harrington family's challenge was officially denied. The courtroom immediately erupted. Nathaniel Harrington screamed that justice had been corrupted. Randolph stormed out, vowing an immediate appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court. Other family members wept or raged, but Judge Crawford had issued his ruling, and legally, it was final. Daniel sat quietly through the pandemonium, processing the fact that he had actually prevailed, that Violet's extraordinary plan had succeeded, and that he now legally owned a plantation and over 100 enslaved people, and possessed the authority to begin their path to freedom. Collision: the war continues. The Harrington family did, in fact, appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court. The appeal was heard in July of 1853. The higher court upheld Judge Crawford's ruling in December of 1853, finding no legal error in his decision. The marriage was valid, the will would stand, and Daniel Freeman was confirmed as the legal owner of Willowbrook Plantation. However, winning the legal battle didn't conclude the war. The Harrington family launched a campaign of social and economic pressure designed to force Daniel to surrender the property. They persuaded other planters to refuse to conduct business with him. They circulated malicious rumors that he had murdered Violet. They attempted to convince the enslaved people at Willowbrook that Daniel's promises of freedom were simply lies intended to keep them obedient. More critically, there were threats of violence. Daniel received multiple warnings that he would be killed if he did not leave Virginia. On several nights, armed men appeared near Willowbrook, apparently intending to attack. Daniel organized a defense using free men from the property, establishing patrols and watch systems. Despite these immense challenges, Daniel initiated the manumission process. Virginia law required that newly freed slaves leave the state within 12 months unless they received special permission to remain. Daniel began filing manumission papers for individuals and families, coordinating with Underground Railroad networks to assist those who chose to go north, and petitioning the state legislature for permission for those who wished to stay. The process was both slow and costly. Each manumission required legal documentation, fees, and often bribes to officials who resented a black man controlling such significant wealth. But Daniel persevered. By the close of 1854, he had freed 37 people. By the end of 1855, another 41 were free. He was systematically dismantling the enslaved labor force that had created Willowbrook's prosperity. He also began hiring paid laborers to work the tobacco fields, free black people, poor whites, and immigrants willing to work for wages rather than under compulsion. It was difficult. Most workers were suspicious of a black landowner. Many quit after facing hostility from neighboring planters. But Daniel gradually built a workforce that allowed him to keep the plantation running while continuing manumissions. In 1856, Daniel sold half of the plantation land to a group of Pennsylvania Quakers who planned to establish a free black farming community in Virginia. The sale generated $60,000, which Daniel used to fund further manumissions and to purchase property in Ohio, where freed Willowbrook residents could relocate and establish farms. The Virginia planter class observed this with growing horror. Daniel was demonstrating that enslaved labor was not an economic necessity, that free black people could farm successfully, and that their entire system could be undone if people simply chose to do so. He represented an existential threat to their society, and they were determined to destroy him. In 1857, the Virginia legislature enacted a law explicitly targeting Daniel's situation. The law declared that no person who had been enslaved in Virginia could own slaves in Virginia, even if they had been freed. Any property ownership that included enslaved people had to be sold within 6 months, with proceeds reverting to the former owner's heirs. The law was clearly unconstitutional and directly aimed at Daniel. Peton filed immediate legal challenges, but the law created uncertainty that slowed Daniel's manumission efforts. Some freed people chose to leave the state immediately rather than risk re-enslavement if the law was upheld. Others stayed, trusting Daniel to fight it. The legal battle over the law ascended to federal court, where, in 1858, judges ruled that Virginia could not retroactively nullify property transfers or target specific individuals with punitive legislation. The law was struck down, but the harm had been done. Daniel had lost an entire year, seen his community dispersed, and spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal defense. By 1859, Daniel had freed 93 of the original 117 enslaved people. The remaining 24 were in the process of being freed or had chosen to remain voluntarily as paid workers until they decided where to go. Willowbrook Plantation was being transformed. The remaining operation was smaller, based on paid labor, generating modest profits that Daniel used to support freed people and fund abolitionist causes. The main house, where Daniel now resided, had become a safe house on the Underground Railroad, concealing fugitives and helping them reach northern states. Daniel himself had become a potent symbol. Abolitionists celebrated him as proof that enslaved people could thrive when given opportunity. Slaveholders despised him as a dangerous illustration of what would happen if their system went unchallenged. He declined invitations to speak in northern cities, believing his presence in Virginia was essential. He received death threats weekly, which he took seriously but refused to let deter his work. In April of 1860, Daniel remarried. His new wife was a free black woman named Grace Hammond, the daughter of freed people from Maryland, who had come to Virginia specifically to work alongside Daniel. Their marriage was public, legal in Virginia because both were free, and celebrated by the freed Willowbrook community. Both were 38 years old. They had found a partnership built on a shared dedication to dismantling slavery from within. Glowing Star: The Legacy of Willowbrook. When the Civil War began in April of 1861, Daniel immediately offered Willowbrook as a resource to the Union cause. He provided food, supplies, and refuge for those escaping slavery. He recruited free men to act as scouts and guides for Union forces. When the war finally ended in April of 1865, with slavery abolished across the entire nation, Daniel had already freed every person at Willowbrook. His work simply continued under a new legal framework. In 1868, Randolph Harrington, who had never accepted the loss of his family's plantation, made one final attempt to reclaim Willowbrook. He sued Daniel, arguing that even though the original will stood, Daniel should be compelled to compensate the heirs for the property value they had lost. The suit was summarily dismissed. The war had altered everything. Virginia courts were now under Reconstruction authority. Black landowners were protected by federal law. Randolph had no standing and no chance of success. Daniel lived until 1891, dying at the age of 69 of natural causes. He spent 40 years as a free man, 39 of those years as a successful landowner and community leader. He and Grace had 6 children, all born free, all educated, who became teachers, ministers, and business owners within Virginia's free black community. Willowbrook Plantation was divided among their children upon Daniel's death. The land that had been farmed by enslaved labor for over a century became the foundation for a thriving free black farming community that endured well into the 20th century. The main house was converted into a school for black children in 1896. The Harrington family never recovered from the scandal. Nathaniel died in 1863, bitter and destitute. Randolph relocated to Texas after the war and died in 1879, having not spoken to his sister Lydia for 20 years. Lydia, who had always been more insightful than her brother, eventually accepted her mother's actions. She visited Willowbrook once in 1870, meeting Daniel and observing what the plantation had become. She told him that she finally understood her mother's objective, and that she regretted staying silent instead of offering her support. In 1937, a historian researching Reconstruction in Virginia discovered the court records of Harrington versus Freeman and the extraordinary story behind them. She interviewed Daniel's surviving children and grandchildren, gathered documents, and published an article describing what she called the most remarkable case of resistance to slavery from within the system. The article brought renewed attention to Violet and Daniel's story. Some historians praised it as brilliant strategic resistance. Others criticized it as too individualistic, arguing that it didn't challenge the system broadly enough. Some questioned whether a relationship between an enslaved person and their owner could ever truly be consensual, regardless of a later marriage. These complex debates have persisted through the 20th and into the 21st century. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power dynamics, consent, resistance, and the moral compromises necessary for survival within evil systems. There are no easy answers. What is undeniably clear is that Violet Harrington and Daniel Freeman undertook extraordinary risks to achieve something unprecedented. Their marriage, however complex its beginnings, ultimately led to freedom for over 100 people. Daniel utilized inherited wealth to establish a flourishing free black community in Virginia. Their story fundamentally challenges simplistic views of slavery, race, and resistance. The Willowbrook School, housed in the former plantation residence, operated until 1968 when integration led to consolidation with other schools. The building was torn down in 1975. Some of the plantation land remains in the hands of Daniel's descendants. Other parts were sold over time. Nothing remains visible of the quarters where the enslaved people lived or the fields they worked. But the story endures, passed down through generations of Daniel's family, documented in court records, and studied by historians. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, people found unique ways to resist. That love could blossom in impossible circumstances. That the powerful occasionally chose justice over maintaining their power. And that the death of one woman created freedom for the lives of many people. This mystery highlights that inheritance is not just about physical property, but about legacy. That resistance to slavery took many forms, some conventional and others radically unprecedented. That the relationships between enslaved and free people were far more complicated than simple oppression and submission. And that documents sealed away for a century sometimes reveal stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about how meaningful change actually happens. Thinking, face your thoughts. What are your feelings about this story? Do you believe Violet and Daniel's relationship could have been genuinely consensual, given the extreme power imbalance? Do you think Daniel's inheritance and his use of it justified the controversial means by which he obtained it? Do you believe Violet deserves credit for attempting to atone for her role as a slave owner, or criticism for having participated in the system for so long? Share your comments below and let us know your perspective on this complex chapter in Virginia history. If you enjoyed this detailed account and want more dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to Whispers and Frames. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that explore the complicated intersections of love, power, justice, and resistance in America's past. Remember, the truth is almost always more layered than it initially seems. And history holds countless stories that defy our expectations about what was possible, even during the nation's darkest periods. See you next time.